Welcome to the SecureWorld Sessions. We're a cybersecurity podcast that is all about access. Access to people and ideas that can impact your career and your organization. My name is Bruce Sussman, and I'm Director of Content at SecureWorld and your podcast host today. In today's session, we are talking to nationally known privacy expert Rebecca Herold about the growth of contact tracing.
You can't preserve privacy if you can't control the data. And to control the data, you have to have security applied to it in many different ways and layers, making sure only those who need access can get access, protect the data from being captured as it's being transmitted through different types of online pathways or other methods.
This is going to be a fantastic interview. And we also have insights from Trend Micro about a relatively new type of ransomware that is holding victims' data hostage for extortion payments. Trend Micro, by the way, is our premier podcast partner. First, though, to our featured topic, the controversy surrounding contact tracing. In the beginning, the coronavirus pandemic led to lockdowns and sheltering in place. Then the world was much quieter. For a time, at least. Next, reopening. Along with reopening, U.S. states announcing they are hiring armies of contact tracers. This group is forecast to number in the tens of thousands. They are building databases and utilizing apps to track and report the movements of those diagnosed with or exposed to the coronavirus. And the heartbeat of this effort is an incredible amount of data. That's why I asked Rebecca Herold, the privacy professor, to be on today's show. She helped author the new NIST Privacy Framework. She's working on an IoT security initiative for NIST right now, and she has her own really successful podcast called Data Security and Privacy with the Privacy Professor. So be sure and check that out. Let's dive in now to our interview with Rebecca Herold. And Rebecca, it is fantastic to have you on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce. I really love being here talking with you today about these important topics.
Before we get into specifics on contact tracing, I thought I'd ask you for like a big picture analysis. So we know that a lot of data has to be collected, right? And just in general terms, anytime we start a massive data collection type program, what type of privacy concerns come to mind for you?
Well, the first thing I think of is what data are they going to collect? What data? And why do they need it for the purpose for which they're collecting it? And when we're talking about with COVID-19 tracking infections and trying to get it under control, then I'm thinking, okay, the data that they're collecting should be that which will give us insights into just those issues. But I'm even seeing with so many different types of collection practices, applications, like right here, I'm out of Des Moines, Iowa, and they launched a Test Iowa program to try to track information a couple of months ago. And so I went, of course, Bruce, I went right out there to see what they were going to collect. And on the very first page, I stopped because they asked me for my birth date. And it's like, they don't need my birth date to track COVID, because when you look at the information, they're looking at maybe age groups or age ranges. So the number one would be, what data is being collected and is it necessary? And then how are they going to use that data? Is it only for that reason? Or are they going to start using it for other reasons after they have it collected? Who are they going to share it with? Because here's a huge amount of data about a person's location, about their health, about their age, about their demographics, all sorts of information. Are they going to share it with other entities who are going to use it for other purposes? And also with a regard to privacy, how long are they going to keep that data? Are they going to delete it all after the pandemic's over? We know from past experience after 9/11, the USA Patriot Act was enacted at that point in time to find terrorists, right? To collect all this data about online activities, and it was only going to be temporary. But look now, we still have USA Patriot Act, and not only is it something that has just become a de facto expected type of data collection, but there's even so many lawmakers and those in the Department of Justice that want to expand it way beyond what is already a very wide net that's being thrown to collect that. So those are some of the big picture primary issues just with regard to privacy that I first think about.
Yeah, that was a great list and overview. And I know that you believe, privacy and security are linked. So, in the big picture sense as well, what type of cybersecurity concerns do you have relating to so much data collection?
Yes, well, definitely. I mean, you can't preserve privacy if you can't control the data. And to control the data, you have to have security uh, applied to it in many different ways and layers, making sure only those who need access can get access, protect the data from being captured as it's being transmitted through different types of online pathways or other methods. But what's interesting, again, when I'm looking at these apps, these contact tracing apps, so another thing that I do, I look at the privacy, but then I look at what should be a security policy or security practices statement. So back to my original example with the Test Iowa apps, I looked at that. It's like, what kind of security do they have about that app that they're using? Well, they had it at the bottom to click here to see what security we use. I clicked there. It went to a third-party vendor, not even the third-party vendor. It went to a vendor of the third-party vendor that created the app. So it went to Qualtrics. And Qualtrics talked about how they protect their data. It didn't talk about how the vendor protected their data. It didn't talk about how the state of Iowa did. Qualtrics talked about how they followed requirements, and I'm doing the air quotes right now that you can't see, but they had requirements for ISO 27001. Well, you and I both know that's a standard. It's not like you're going to have that's not a legally binding law.
Right.
And then they had requirements from HITRUST, and it's like, wait, HITRUST is a vendor program to help support compliance with HIPAA. That's another thing that it's not a legal requirement. And then they had best security practices. Okay, so that was a disappointment. But then they also had, we also protect your data according to the laws of Iowa for how we must protect people's data. And they had a link to go to this law. Click the link. What did the link take me to? It took me to the Iowa breach notice law. And when they told me in the statement that they protected according to the security requirements that I would find here, I found no security requirements there. I found a description of what would be considered or what would happen if there was a breach of information. And then the information that they considered personal information was very narrowly defined. So it didn't include, for instance, my birth date, like I had mentioned earlier. That would not
Wow.
be considered. So I'm thinking, okay, this is another bad thing. So I'm not going to do this app or fill it out, which I think a lot of organizations who are doing contact tracing would probably not be that different than my experience with this one.
Mhm.
But they need to understand that they need to just put into place some well vetted security processes, and not only that, but they need to make sure that they actually engineer the app so that it works securely. So another quick example, and I'll go back. I'm hitting on my state here, Iowa, a lot. I
Your
love
home state. Wait a minute.
I know. I love Iowa. I love Iowa, but I am can be very critical. But hopefully it's good critique. I
Well,
don't know if
absolutely. And like you say, it's not just Iowa, right? This is just an example. So
just
yes,
an
go ahead.
example. So I don't know if you remember this, but we actually did have something going on this year besides the pandemic. On February 3rd was the Iowa caucus.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, isn't it
Oh
like
yes.
a century ago? But anyway, so I voted. I vote in every election. I go to the caucuses every single time. So I was at the February 3rd caucus. They had this some new procedures to follow, and it can be a pretty long process physically being there. But it went so much smoother this time. But then they had this app, and this app would quickly report the data back to a central location. And I noticed, because I was watching the person that was using her phone to send the information back, she kept entering the information on her phone. She kept hitting it, kept hitting it. We were there waiting to see, when can we leave? Because we thought we were finished. Well, come to find out, as everyone in the world found out, the app that they were using had some security flaws, but the security flaws were some that a lot of people don't realize are security flaws. So when people think of security, they think of passwords and encryption. But availability or lack of availability is a security issue too. So what happened was there were all of the caucus sites, and I think there was something like 1,100 of them reporting back at the same time, and the central server could not accept them all. So they kind of did their own denial of service type of
Oh my God.
situation. So that was, a big problem. Why did it happen? Because of the way the two reasons from what I learned afterward, because the app was not engineered appropriately to make sure that it would only send, after certain situations or certain buttons were pushed, but also the fact that it didn't make sure that there was bandwidth that would be able to be accommodated. And I'm using that because I see the same things going to happen with the contact tracing, not just, non-availability, but are they actually engineering these apps that they threw together so quickly in many cases? Did they actually test them so that there were no vulnerabilities throughout the entire data life cycle for when data would be collected and then used and then shared and then processed? It really concerns me when I saw some of these apps coming out so quickly, that maybe the integrity of the data, which is so important for contact tracing, right? If we want to know who truly is infected, is accurate in this data, we need to make sure that people can't change that data inappropriately, either accidentally or maliciously. So, there's just so many things at a high level that I could do deep dives into, but that's a, that's a big issue that I'm really concerned with. I found no validation of appropriate third party objective vetting of the contact tracing apps. And that's what I would love to see.
Wow. Well, that is amazing, and it's so funny when you bring up the Iowa caucus and what a technological calamity that ended up being. It's hard to think about. That was also stood up pretty quickly, right? That app, and now, as you point out, we're doing the same thing with contact tracing. I mean, it's like go, 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 right? So that is interesting, and obviously it's when I think about our discussions that we've had, Rebecca, before about the IoT, where it's this, and many times it's a race to market. And we'll get to the security later. We can just bolt it on, but that we know that's not that's not as simple as it sounds, and may never happen. Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to ask you a related question, because we spent a lot of time talking about the apps and some of these technologies. In a lot of states and other countries, I mean, they are standing up thousands of employees who will do what some are calling like traditional contact tracing, where, there's a lot of people calling you, talking to you, texting you, hands-on without an app necessarily to reach you. However, all of that data is going into a database somewhere. So what kind of concerns do you have about that method of contact tracing? Because we're still creating a data trail, right?
Oh, there's definitely a data trail. So now we've not only do we have the technology security issues, but we've expanded out to having the physical security access and the administrative access issues, not just access, but administrative security controls and physical security controls. Because just think, if I'm there doing all these phone calls, I've got all my paper copies of what I'm writing down, and then I put it into some system somewhere. What am I doing with all of those papers? Am I just going to throw them in the trash can for somebody to pick up out in the back alley like so often happens? Or is somebody else going to get copies of those hard copies? So you have to start thinking about these, the actual hard copy of what was written down. And then with administrative types of security, you have to think, well, what about all those people? I mean, I'm so happy that we have so many people volunteering for this, but have they been told not to discuss these things when, they go out and go home, or after it's all over and they're telling stories? Oh my gosh, you should have seen this one person that I talked to. They, I get into discussions there. I mean, we already know from experiences under HIPAA with hospitals and clinics that when you have humans involved, even if they have rules, they're going to talk about the celebrity that was in to get some sort of work or whatever. Well, the same issues are here. Have they established policies and procedures and given them training to follow? And then is there some sort of recourse if they don't follow those? Because certainly being a volunteer to do this is all good. But like, I've done volunteer stuff for my local various things. And usually that training does not include privacy or security. In fact, you might be surprised, and I'm saying this rather facetiously, but I did ask the people at the caucus if they had any training, and they said, yeah, how to use the app, as another example of that. And I said, well, what kind of security did they give you for that? Oh, they told us just to enter the PIN, and they told us what PIN to use. And I'm like, they told you all to use the same PIN? Yeah, that's what we did.
Oh, geez.
So it was like, okay. So when I'm thinking now to the contact tracing, you have people, they're getting all this information. Some people might be telling them some very confidential information about who they were with and where they were when they were with them. I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities. So, keeping information confidential is very important, not to mention then all of the other technical security that has to be implemented.
There are an amazing amount of considerations here, aren't there? But what about the public appetite for contact tracing where it conflicts with privacy? And what would Rebecca like to see before she would agree to download a contact tracing app? That part of the interview is coming up. New insights now on the relatively new Nefilim ransomware. Have you heard of this strain? Yes, it encrypts your organization's data, but it also removes that data beforehand, and the ransomware operators threaten to publish it for the world to see unless you pay the ransom. Now, tips on how to avoid this ransomware are today's Trend Micro Top 3, and they focus on the Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP. Number 1, close your RDP ports to limit intrusions by ransomware actors who abuse RDP. Number 2, Trend Micro says minimize who can access your network or devices via RDP. And number 3, and this is crucial, limit the number of failed login attempts with RDP access, because brute force login attacks are regularly used by ransomware operators. For more specifics on Nefilim ransomware exploits and mitigation, check out the show notes. I've pasted the latest insights in there from Trend Micro, our premier podcast partner. Now, back to our interview with Rebecca Herold, the privacy professor. Let's continue our conversation around contact tracing, privacy, and cybersecurity. One of the things that the experts, health experts, have been saying is we need widespread adoption of this if we're going to make it successful. You talk to a lot of people on your podcast. You hear from a lot of people around the world about privacy and their concerns. What kind of appetite do you think there is for something like this? Obviously, people desire to be safe, right, and minimize the COVID-19, but just from a privacy and security standpoint, can you help us understand what are people thinking around this topic? Probably more than ever before, right? I mean, isn't this really kind of come to the forefront?
It has. And I think probably the number one concern is that, they already have relationships with their healthcare providers, and they've gotten comfortable with their healthcare providers collecting their information, and they have come to understand how they're protecting it. But now they see yet another huge entity, the local governments, the state governments, the federal government. They see now completely different entity that has told them nothing about what they're going to do with that data and who's going to get it, collecting it and putting it all into potentially one big pot. I know one database, if you will. And I know, like, one of the people I spoke with who had concerns about this, they said, well, the government has had all of these huge breaches over the years. And as you know, some of the biggest breaches have been in some of the HR records within the government. And they are like, how, I'm concerned that, my data is just going to be there with millions of other people's data. And if somebody gets in there, they're going to have a field day taking all of that data. And now all of a sudden, not only do they have all of my other breach data from my credit cards, but now they're going to have all of my data that the government has that includes my health information. So I think bottom line, the biggest concern is just the fact that there is lack of transparency and lack of understanding of really what are they going to do with this data. And, most people want to have contact tracing to work. They want to be able to do it to stop this pandemic, for sure. But it's like, what happens then after that's over? How am I going to continue to have my data used for other things that maybe will deny me my health insurance, or maybe it will prevent me from getting my pension? There's all these questions, and right now there's no really answers to tell them how that data is going to be protected and limited in use after everything is finished.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past, I think I saw you speak on this during one of the keynotes at a SecureWorld conference, was a lot of times we don't even know where this data really is going to end up ultimately, or
Mm-hmm.
how it will ever be destroyed. I mean, isn't that right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, especially, with all of the devices we have. So you have the data that you're giving knowingly through an app, and you don't know the third parties who are involved. Just like, way back to my beginning example with the Test Iowa. It's not Test Iowa, the government, that put that app up. It's a vendor, and it's not the vendor that's actually getting the data. It's yet a vendor of the vendor who's putting that data there. So, how many others are getting access beyond those three entities? Um, we just don't know. So, those things are very, it's hard to keep track of. And now it's not the same as contact tracing, but even with contact tracing and like the human interactions with physically doing the phone calls, I wonder a lot of times, because this is something I've helped organizations with their work from home offices and so on. I think about, well, do they have an Amazon Echo or Dot turned on where they're doing these conversations? Do they have their Nest or their Ring that's looking at their monitor when they're doing this? So I guess with regard to that data, what is in the environment, the physical environment, that's capturing data that you wouldn't even think about? And all of a sudden you have somebody contacting you saying, we know this about you. And you're sitting there thinking, how did they know that? I only spoke to this one person on the phone, and I trusted them. Well, maybe they had their security camera on in the room that they were doing their work from, where they were making all their calls. And all of a sudden, somebody with Shodan was able to collect that. That's something else. At the SecureWorld talks, I mentioned Shodan and my various types of experiments I've done with that, just to find those types of areas where I can see in people's houses because they aren't secured.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I hadn't even thought about those other, IoT or IIoT devices that could be around and listening or watching. And those are all great considerations that a lot of organizations probably haven't thought of either. So that's
Mm-hmm.
very good. Now, I want to ask you a little bit about something unrelated to this topic, and then we'll come back to contact tracing to wrap things up. But
Okay.
I know that you, Rebecca, have spent a lot of time on the NIST Privacy Framework.
Yes.
What has your role been? Kind of help our audience understand, and what's the goal of the effort as you see it? And by the way, I'm sure most of our audience knows, but the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, so a sister framework to this
Mm-hmm.
privacy one, has kind of become the de facto standard or framework for within which many organizations build their cybersecurity practices. So tell us about the privacy framework now.
Yes. So thank you for that, because it is a great framework. I think it's something that has been needed for a long time, and it was created to fit hand in glove, if you will, with the cybersecurity framework. So it is very much a complementary framework to that one. So I was part of the NIST Privacy Framework development team for 1.5 years. And the final version of the NIST Privacy Framework was published just earlier this year on January 16th. And so during the time I spent working with NIST on the framework, I did a lot of research for the wide areas of domains where we talked about privacy and provide where NIST provides in the framework guidance. I did a wide range of research into privacy risk and how to mitigate them, a lot of writing on the draft, and also supporting documents. I worked on creating use cases on online webinars and slides. I created use cases for in-person workshops and actually went to the Boise, where University of Idaho, or maybe it's Idaho State. I always get the two backwards, but anywhere, I was
I
out
don't know.
there.
I can't help you. So
Yeah. So it's the Blue Mustangs. I remember that.
okay, yeah,
So
Boise State. Then okay, yes.
Boise State, yes. So they had a workshop there, and so I facilitated 2 days of discussions in a room full of privacy professionals there, talking about the controls, and so all those different things. And basically, NIST has a pretty clear stated goal. If you go, our listeners look at nist.gov/privacy-framework. They have 3 goals, and it's to build customer trust by helping to support, ethical decision making in the design of products and services. That not only helps to ensure that data is optimized in a useful way, but also that it also will support privacy. The second one is for fulfilling compliance obligations and future proofing devices and products and services. And then also the third goal is to facilitate communication with your customers, with those who come in to assess how well you're doing privacy, with those inside of your organization who you're working with to, say, here's what we need to do with regard to privacy and the controls, because so oftentimes people who establish privacy controls in an organization, they don't know how to explain it to the business unit managers or to the corporate lawyers and so on. So it facilitates that type of communication.
Great. That's fantastic. Well, that's an excellent overview, and really appreciate that, because I know that you were really passionate about that project, and congratulations on getting it done, right?
Yes, thanks.
That had to feel good.
Exactly.
All right. So I want to touch on the Internet of Things, which, of course,
Yes.
we love the Internet of Things. I mean, we can do so many cool things with it, and
Mm-hmm.
it powers our homes. Increasingly, it's powering businesses. It's allowing us to do some incredible stuff. But I thought maybe you could share with us a couple of real life examples, if you would, of what can go wrong if we collect and share data without the proper safeguards.
Yes, yes. Well, definitely. And I guess as an aside, after I stopped the privacy framework, um, stopped being on that team, they asked me to join the NIST Cybersecurity for IoT program
No.
team.
Well, there you
So,
go.
yeah, so we're actually looking very closely at the cybersecurity and privacy capabilities of the devices themselves, and then also the non-technical controls around that, and building catalogs of controls to consider. But oh my gosh, there's so many different examples. So just one of the things that's a problem is with the device itself. Oftentimes it's collecting just so much data, and this data is communicated and accessed through apps. So the apps are not appropriately secured, or have security applied to all of that data. And just a year ago, there was a huge breach of a database for an Internet of Things management platform. So here's your vendor that works with many different IoT devices, who's managing all the data collected from those devices. Well, they had all this data online, and they didn't have it even password protected. So they had more than 2 billion with a B, logs, and it contained everything from user passwords and reset codes, and even recordings of cameras showing conversations. So, because of just the simple lack of security over the data collected by many different IoT devices, there have been huge um, problems with those types of breaches. But then if you talk about contact tracing apps, you now get into, things such as having people's health data, their location, their names, and so on. And in fact, one of the other things I do occasionally is be an expert witness for different cases. So one of the expert witness cases that I provided expert testimony for, and I can't get into the details of that yet. Someday I will, Bruce, and then maybe that would be another good talk to have.
Okay, good. Well, let me know. I'll have you back on. That sounds juicy. All right.
But that was through the IoT devices that you have through your automobiles, and it has to do with something that's going to be a concern with the contact tracing, because there was someone who was tracking a ex partner, and they were able to get access to the location data of the IoT device, and then from there ended up finding that person and assaulting that person. So that has so many different issues related to it, because it had to do with not having appropriate identity verification to make sure that malicious people couldn't get access to location data that shouldn't. It had to do with even how that the app that connected to the IoT device connected to it, and making sure that somebody couldn't get around using the app so that they could get to it using a wireless interceptor to capture data as it's being collected in the device. So it's not just about, I guess, for your listeners, it's not just about the data and how it can be misused in huge ways, like those 2 billion logs. Certainly that can cause harm to someone mentally, perhaps, depending on the data, or financially. But with IoT devices, there have really been exploits of vulnerabilities in processes and the way the devices are engineered that result in physical harm. So I think that is a huge issue with IoT devices that I've been seeing over the years, and I see it continue to get more severe. The fact that it's no longer just about data security and privacy. Certainly it still is, but IoT devices and contact tracing and knowing about people and their race and their religion and other things that some of these contact tracing apps are collecting. And I've seen them collecting those things because that tells people who they're congregating with and so on. That can lead to maybe physical harm to those people who might be targeted. So it really has, we've come full circle where we have not only data that talks about misuse of data, but now we have physical needs to protect that data, because it can bring physical harms to those who are using the technology that the data is collected from.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and you're echoing a sentiment. And I think if Jason Whitty, who's the CISO at J.P. Morgan Chase, if he were here with us, I think he would agree with you wholeheartedly, because he told me a couple of years ago when he was still CISO of U.S. Bank, and I interviewed him at SecureWorld Twin Cities, which is where U.S. Bank is based. So that's where he was at the time. And he said, cybersecurity now is really life security. And he was talking about connected devices and pacemakers and all kinds of things that, hospital machinery. But I mean, all the things, the example you gave proves that point again. So that's really fascinating. Now, I want to know, to bring this full circle here, Rebecca, are you in or are you out when it comes to downloading a contact tracing app? Or filling out the Trace.io or whatever you said it was called, or what needs to change before you feel comfortable doing so?
Yes, well, certainly, as you know, I don't feel comfortable right now. So
Yes, you're out. That's
here's
what I thought.
I'm out. I'm out right now. However, I do think it's important to have those insights. So my hope is that they will make some changes. So number one, prove to me that that app is secure. And how can you prove that to me? You can show me an assessment by an objective third party that actually went through. Don't show me what the programmers did. I mean, I started my career, and I still do some minimal programming, but I started as a systems engineer. This isn't a knock against programmers, but I do know when you build something, when you build a system, oftentimes you might get so close to it and spend so much time with it that you might miss some of the security things that you really need to have in there. And you need to have an objective third party to assess it and say, yes, this has been secured appropriately. And you could use, the ISO 27001 domains to base that on, or the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and the Privacy Framework, actually. Then I would want to know what their privacy notice and security notice says that tells me who is going to get this data besides you, who says that you're collecting it, and how long are you going to keep it before you delete it? Because that's something I have found. I can't even think of another company, an IoT company or an app company that has literally actually deleted data when it was no longer needed. I mean, data tends to be kept forever, but for these contact tracing, tell me how you're going to delete it, when, and how I can check on that to make sure that you actually did it. And then one last thing, this gets back to something that's often not thought of, but like my expert witness cases, how are you going to perform identity verification for those people who say that they should get access to my data because maybe they're a family member of mine or whatever? I want to make sure that you aren't falling for the tricks of social engineering that malicious people might be pulling on you. And I know that there's a lot of people, we've already seen phishing attempts in the last 2 months skyrocket in frequency. You know that as soon as people start using the contact tracing apps widely, there's going to be a lot of social engineering going on where they're trying to get to that data, and you better have some really good identity verification processes in place to make sure that you don't give it to someone who could be malicious.
Fantastic. That's really great insight. And I love how thorough you are on this topic. You're absolutely the right person to have on and discuss this. And it's been such a pleasure. And I'm just picturing you, Rebecca. I don't know what you do in your free time, but I'm like picturing you reading privacy statements from companies just for fun. And you might be the only person I've ever met that does that.
I do a little bit of that, but I have a young but large Doberman, a rescue Doberman. So I do enjoy doing some things outside with the dog and also listening to the beautiful songbirds at night. So I try to get away from technology at least for an hour or two at night before I go to sleep.
That is fantastic. Well, great. Well, Rebecca Herold, the privacy professor, always great talking with you. I will put a link to your podcast in the show notes and a link to Rebecca's LinkedIn page as well if you want to connect with her. Thanks for being with us today, Rebecca. It was great.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I love talking with Rebecca, and I'm pretty sure you can see why after listening to that interview. Thanks, Rebecca. I appreciate you. Will you download a contact tracing app? That's the question. Why or why not? Let us know. media@secureworldexpo.com. I'd love to hear your reasoning on this. The address again is media@secureworldexpo.com. Well, thanks again to Trend Micro for sponsoring today's podcast and to our show editor, Pete, for his great work. On behalf of the entire SecureWorld team, I'm Bruce Sussman, your host of the SecureWorld Sessions, and let's catch up again on Tuesday.